everyone! In this video I will explain how to use the Arhi.Teach Material Library. The material library comes in the form of the archive like this. The Arhi.Teach Material. Inside the archive there is a content folder that corresponds to the content folder of your project. In it there is a folder called Unreal Shop. Next is the Arhi.Teach Materials folder, and there are actual materials. Our task is to add this to the project. For this, we need to unzip the archive and copy the Unreal Shop folder into the content folder of our project at the root level. This is the directory structure. It should look like as follows. First, the folder, content of your project. Next is the Unreal Shop folder, and inside it, the Arhi.Teach Material folder. By adding the library with materials to our project inside the Arhi.Teach Material folder, we will be able to see this kind of directory structure. Here are several basic materials. From them we can create instances and already make the materials we need in the instances. First of all, the main material MBase v7 is the primary base material to cover almost all our tasks related to opaque materials. It can also be used for fabrics, but for fabrics we have a separate material called mFabric v7. So, to create glowing materials you can use emissive. The glow function is also present in the basic material, but the emissive material is simpler, so it will work much faster. With fewer functions, therefore, for creating simple glowing objects, the emissive material is most suitable. The material emissive background is made for us to create, for example, a background image. In this case, the background image created based on this material is applied to a sphere. The main functionality is the ability to add an image and adjust the brightness. The material mFabric is used for various fabrics. The mFoliage material is suitable for creating, for example, plant leaves. Next, we have folders. The folders contain samples with the basic materials that we can use in our scenes. The first folder is for basic textures. We do not need to touch them. These textures are applied in the parent materials. Next, the concrete folder. Here are various plastering options. If necessary, you can edit them as you need. In the emissive folder, there are samples for glowing materials. Here are several options from the settings. The main one is emissive intensity, which sets the brightness of the glow. You can also set the color for the glow and set the color for the object itself. So basically, if we turn off the glow, we see the object itself. This can be useful when we are making, for example, a lampshade for a chandelier. Most often it's white, and when the light is turned on, there is usually some shade. There is also a Fresnel parameter that creates a smooth fade from the center to the edge. With the value of 1, everything will be illuminated evenly, and with the value of 0, there will be a corresponding fade. This parameter can be adjusted. And the parameters metallic roughness and specular define the reflections on the object's surface. The next material, emissive background, is for creating background image, which can be applied, for example, to a sphere. The material is double-sided, so we can also see the inside of the sphere. Here in the settings there is styling for setting image position, but most of the time it's not used. And there is the emissive parameter, which sets the glow for the background image. Also from the settings we can change the blend mode parameter from opaque to translucent. This is in case we need our sphere with the background image to allow light to pass through it. Otherwise, in opaque mode, it will block the lightning. The next folder with material samples is fabric. Here there are also the main materials that we can use in our projects. And we can also edit them at our discretion. But it's recommended to make a copy of the material before editing and edit the copy to avoid losing the material. We also have the tool fabric here. It's called fabric tool. And also, there is a curtain fabric here. It's called curtain. The feature of this material is that it allows sunlight to pass through it, and the fabric is beautifully illuminated by the sunlight. For the other materials, this feature is disabled. They are not very suitable for this. The next folder is foliage. Here are samples for vegetation, in particular for leaves. The first material has an opacity mask applied. It is suitable for leaves with opacity masks, and the second material is without opacity mask, suitable for leaves with transparency masks, and the second material is without transparency mask. More precisely, the material is basically same, it's just that the transparency mask is not used in this one. The subsurface parameter is used in both materials to make them translucent in the light. One important note for vegetation, when we use a material with transparency mask. Here, there is a parameter called opacity mask clip value. It can be changed when the trees are at a distance. In this case, we can change the parameter and set it to, for example, 0.2. The next folder contains samples of materials for glass. This folder also includes parent materials highlighted with a bright green stripe. Also, there is regular glass, improved, and there is simplified glass, which is suitable for windows. In it, refractions are turned off, and from each of those parent materials, there are several variants. Let's take a closer look at the settings. To begin with, let's take colored glass. Here from the EOR settings, this is the refractive strength. The refraction strength is also set by the refraction front and the refraction side parameters. This parameter needs to be carefully adjusted so that the appearance of the glass looks sufficiently good. The normal parameter sets the strength of the normals map influence. This can be useful when we need to create glass with some pattern. With the value of 1, there will be no drawing on the material. Normal tile sets the tiling, and opacity sets the transparency. At a value of 1, the glass becomes black, opaque. You can also set the roughness of reflections on the surface of the glass, and you can set the strength of reflections on the surface of the glass. The color of the glass is set by the color parameter. The value of white will be completely transparent glass. To tint it, we make the color darker. For example, dark glass. To change the color, we accordingly choose the color we need. Other glass options are glass nice. Here this glass contains many more parameters. There is also the possibility of applying a normal map, or switch it to use the virtual texture. You can use it as a regular texture, or switch it to virtual texture if necessary. If necessary, you can set the tiling and other position parameters for this texture. The other parameters are similar to the previous class, but here the metallic parameter is added, which is necessary if we need to increase the reflective capability, for example, make such glass mirror-like. We increase the metallic value, set it to 1, and decrease the transparency. We end up with a mirror-like glass. In this type, we can no longer set the color of the glass. It is set, but it only affects the reflection of objects. The glass itself remains just as transparent, and there are several options from this material. The next material is glass simple. It's used to make glass, for example, for windows. The feature of this material is that it has no refractions. Minimum settings, and we can simply apply it to any glass where no refraction is required. The next folder contains samples of materials for the ground surface. Here, for example, there is an option for asphalt, an option of soil, and an option for grass. These materials use the textures from Megascans, but you can substitute your own textures and achieve the desired look for the material. Landscape material. It's used to set the material for the surface of the Earth. The feature of this material is that it contains 4 layers. It is multi-layered. So basically, if we look at the parent material, it has 4 layers. A texture is assigned to each layer, and we can draw on the surface of the ground with this material. We switch to landscape mode, we switch to paint mode. Next, we see 4 layers. Here they are used in the material. If we have just created the ground surface and it has no layers, we need to add new layers. After that, we can select the material we need and draw on the surface. The next folder contains samples of materials for metals. There are also several options here. You can use them or create your own variations based on them. For example, there is polished material. This is aluminum, bronze, chrome, which can be used for mirrors, and polished chrome, and gold. The next material samples are stones. For example, black marble, white marble, and you can also set a normal map for it so that the surface is uneven, has texture. Next, material for wood. Materials for wood. Also several options. And the material wood plank. These are separate planks. This material is suitable when we use floor that was made with the floor generator. If the object has multiple materials assigned, each with a separate plank, a separate texture for the plank. Then we can assign these materials to such a floor. In the material, you can set the rotation. For example, if the material is not at the right angle, as it displayed here, we set it to 0.25, rotate it by 90 degrees, and apply it to the other boards. You can also add additional boards by simply copying the last material and assigning your textures to it. All settings are adjusted using the first material. The others just inherit from it. Therefore, for example, in the second material, we see that everything is gray, while in the first material, parameters are set. If we change something here, it also changes in all other planks. Now, let's take a closer look at the material settings. For example, let's take one of the ready-made materials. They are all based on one basic material, so the settings are the same everywhere. The first section, tiling, is responsible respectively for the position of the texture and its repetition. The rotation angle parameter also controls the direction of the texture. It changes from 0 to 1, where 0 is rotation of 360 degrees. Therefore, for example, a 90-degree rotation will be 0.25. Next, there is a parameter called switch page called advanced. This parameter determines the use of texture. If the checkbox is not checked, then just the color is used, which we can use to fill the surface of the object. So basically, if we check the box, we switch to using a texture, and here we can set the desired texture. if the textures can be in regular mode or virtual. And here, in this case, we switch which texture to use. Either it's regular, ordinary texture, or it's a virtual texture. Next, there's the base tone. This allows you to tint the texture with some color. Besides the base tone, there is also overlap. It is overlay. This parameter allows you to cover over the existing texture with color. For example, right now the base color is set to pink. We set it to 1 here. Texture was completely covered by this pink color. If we set some intermediate value, we kind of dissolve the texture into this color. This parameter is slightly different from base tone. Base tone adds a tint to the texture, while overlap mixes the texture with color, as if covering it with second layer. Therefore, we can use these parameters, for instance, if we need to make the wood color more uniform. To start, let's choose a wood color, for instance, let be like this brown one. And now, using the overlap parameter, we kind of tinted it. I will disable the use of dirt now. A very convenient parameter to make a less contrasting or bright texture. As if mixing it, dissolving it into another color. Next, among the parameters, there is albedo, which corresponds to the brightness of the texture. There is desaturate, which allows you to desaturate the texture. 1 completely bleaches it, 0 means no changes, and -1 makes it more saturated. The power parameter creates this kind of contrast with brightness, and the base contrast parameter sets the contrast for the texture. The next parameter is the use of the texture to simulate dirt. Switch base dirt includes the overlay texture of dirt. We'll switch to using color, so it's more visible. The texture is currently set. You can change it to some other one. For example, this one. And we can see how this texture has been applied on top. From the parameters, we have the UV index. This parameter can set different UV coordinates. So the object has several layers with UV coordinates. So we can overlay this texture using different coordinates. Next is invert dirt, which means you can invert the texture. Next, dirt tiling adjusts the number of repetitions. Dirt contrasts accordingly adjusts the texture contrast, intensity, and desaturate. In case the texture is colored, it can be desaturated. The next section is specular. So, the reflections. Here we can use simple reflections, which are controlled by the specular parameter, where 1 is maximum reflections and 0 is no reflections. We can also use metallic reflections. For this, we check the Use Metallic box. And additional parameters are added, as well the reflections becoming more vivid. Metallic reflections are used accordingly for metallic objects, where you need to achieve brighter reflections. They can also be used for chrome, for mirrors, and so on. Ordinary objects, which do not have metallic properties, have duller reflections, and are mainly used with regular specular reflections. Also, in metallic reflections, there are parameters such as anisotropy and highlight direction. This is necessary in cases where, for example, we are using a polished material, as in this example, the highlight appears stretched. These parameters are precisely what regulate the stretching of the highlight. The use of these parameters can be in the example of metallic materials. We can also use some texturing reflections. For this, we switch the specular advanced parameter and we get the option to load a texture here. We select the texture. Let's take this one, for example. And here we see that the degree of reflections is regulated for us. First of all, we can choose any of the channels from the texture. A regular texture consists of 3 channels: red, green, and blue. Here we can use one of the channels. This is necessary in case, for example, we take a texture back from Megascan. Here we have this yellow texture. In fact, it contains 3 textures, but they are split into different channels. And for reflections, for example, the red channel is used, that is the red one. The other 2 channels can be used in other cases, for example, for roughness. But for regular textures, which we usually prepare, we do not need to touch these checkboxes. Here we also have specular map tiling, where we can set the texture scale and settings for the texture itself. Base specular is the base reflections, which are influenced by the specular map override parameter. We can kind of reduce the intensity of the texture. At a value of 0, we reduce the use of the texture to 0. In this way, we use reflection purely from base specular parameter. Intermediate values up to 1 increase the brightness of the texture, and values greater than 1 make it more contrasty. Specular map intensity also adjusts the texture for reflections. The next section is roughness. A roughness value of 0 makes the surface completely smooth. Value of 1 makes the surface completely matte. The roughness property also has a parameter called Fresnel, which makes reflections at the sharp angles smoother. Higher values make the object completely matte. We can also use some texture here for roughness. For this, we check the roughness advanced box and can also load any of the textures. Here you can see how our roughness changes depending on the texture. With the parameters below, we can also adjust the degree of this roughness. You can adjust the tiling, texture contrast, and you can invert it. Plus, we can enable dirt, which adds a dirt texture to the roughness that we previously loaded into the dirt map. This texture can separately adjust contrast and intensity. A value of 0 excludes the influence of the dirt texture on the object's roughness. A value of 1 has an effect, and then here we can set the contrast. Thus, for setting the roughness of the object, we can use as many as 2 textures. The next is section bump. The unevenness on the surface of the object. Here we can also use a texture for this. Right now, for example, a wood texture is set. From the settings, we can rotate this texture to give it the desired direction. Next, you can set the tiling. That is the repetition of the texture, and set the intensity. This parameter can be inverted either negatively or positively, depending on which direction we want the bumps to protrude. Parameter shift normal high also affects the texture. The thing is, in this case, we are converting a regular black and white texture or a chord one, so basically a height map into a normal map. The normal high parameter affects these processes, but most of the time it's better not to touch it. We can also use both regular and virtual textures here. To this we can switch to using normal map. In this case we check the switch bump box, and now we can upload some normal map here. For example, let's choose this map. Next is the mask parameter, which means you can apply transparency mask to this object. To do this, check the box and set some mask. Let's use some texture like this. Of course, it's best to use black and white mask where we have pronounced pattern. Then the mask will work more adequately. But we can also edit it here. For example, you can invert the mask. You can see how our texture has changed. Next, you can set the number of repetitions, so the scale of the texture and power. Power affects how this mask is used. Okay, and then the last parameter is emissive. It includes the glow on the surface of the object. So we have considered all the material parameters. They allow us to recreate most of the materials we need. Also, if we are using any fabric material, we take materials such as fabric for this purpose. I will make a copy to show its settings. Let's assign the material to the object and open it. Besides all the other parameters we saw in the previous materials, here we have additional settings like Fresnel. Base Fresnel Bright makes the edges of the object brighter. Thus, soft tissues are simulated, making the material appear softer. This is handled by the Fresnel Bright and Fresnel Power, which regulate the transition boundary. Also, from the parameters that were not in the previous material, there is a subsurface, which allows you to set light scattering within the material. For this, we need to set it to 1 and specify the color. This parameter is used in conjunction with the two-sided foliage material type and can be applied for creating curtain materials. In general, any materials where we need to set transparency. Translucency. Similarly, materials for plant leaves are also made this way. With this, we have completed the overview of materials. I hope this library will be useful in your work, and you will be able to easily create your own materials and perform your tasks more quickly.